Hello and most welcome to the Palm House, smack in the middle of Gothenburg for Heidegger 1525. I will today focus entirely on Paul Livingston's article Wittgenstein Mathematics and the Temporality Technique. And I finished off a little bit last lecture with see what page it was, page 5, and how Dummett and his interpretation is looking into the Wittgensteinian take in remarks on the foundations of mathematics. The last thing we were looked into was this counting of a group of 5 boys and 7 girls in the classroom, and whether they were wrong or right of being counted together. And 5 boys and 7 girls doesn't make 13, but because each of us can decide for ourselves how to interpret the rules, that would be, according to Dummett, a possibility. But at least it would not be left out of the possible takes on mathematics. I will look in to see what Livingston thinks about this. The most we can say is that given our practices and conventions, we would not count this way, but there is no intelligible neutral perspective from which we can say that they are in fact wrong to do so, or that they thereby get the facts or the mathematical realities wrong. And here is pointed to an absolutely excellent page, an excellent aspect of the whole thing. I would say the problem is having this feature of being unavoidable. Definitely both in Kant and Dummett and the majority of people. They either go into the one or the other. Dummett objects, for obvious reasons, to this kind of position. It is clear and evident aspect of mathematical practice, whether sophisticated or not. That we do feel a kind of responsibility to the mathematical facts, and that we will subject to criticism those who we think have got them wrong. This is as much an aspect of everyday practices of counting and calculating with numbers as it is of sophisticated mathematical proof itself. If we do not at any rate experience the constraint of feeling responsible, whether in calculation or proof, to something that is not simply a matter of decision or arbitrary convention, we are not doing math or engaging in the kinds of practices that we take doing math to be. As we do in fact engage in these practices in the course of our ordinary lives. Although Putnam and Dummett disagree about the extent and endurance of Wittgenstein's conventionalism overall, they agree in thinking that Wittgenstein situates the question of existence or determinacy of mathematical truths within a constitutive consideration of the extent and limits of our specific linguistic practices. In other words, the form of the question seen in this way is given that our practices can go only so far. What should we say about mathematical truths that outstrip them? Further, what links both of the interpretations, despite their differences, is the thought that mathematical truths are themselves determinately constrained by the limited actual extent of our specific conventional linguistic practices of decision, explanation, or calculations. Remember Barbara Tversky, Lakoff Johnson, and many others who come to see that mathematics, philosophy, abstract thinking is a practice of the body, of the hand. So far as these practices go, we may talk without difficulty about mathematical truths or entities as determinate, as fixed or as real. But if we try to go any further in our conception of them, we are subscribing to a misleading and dangerous platonizing picture of mathematical reality. One which has no warrant in this reality, as anyway it is in any meaningful sense available itself. This thought has its broader setting in the context of familiar questions much pursued in the philosophy of mathematics. Questions such as, are mathematical truths in us or out there? Are they fixed independently of our procedures for accessing them, or our ways of knowing about them? Are they fundamentally created or discovered? Now, my own view is that Wittgenstein's considered answer to all of these questions is neither nor, and that his basic reasons for this answer turn on his nuanced conception of just how mathematics is integrated into a human life. Rather than argue for this here, though, I will just try to show how this more nuanced conception fits within an idea of mathematical practice as shaped by, and in turn decisively shaping, a kind of life that we can recognize more broadly as human, and thus a fortiori not something that could be pursued in any meaningful way by something that does not live this kind of life. For example, a machine or a computer. Putnam and Dummett's interpretations have it in common that they are intended primarily to address the question, what is mathematical truth and how is it fixed, if at all? But Wittgenstein is not asking this question, or at any rate is not asking only this question. Just as much he is asking about what doing mathematics is and how it is related to what mathematics is about. And he answers these latter questions not with any specific overall account of the metaphysics or mathematical truths or facts, the logical implications of their accessibility, but rather by adverting to the general and familiar circumstances in which practices such as counting, calculation, problem solving, and proof have their role within, what we already know as our lives. In this consideration, one concept and experience that has a particular central significance, extending also far beyond just its implications for mathematical practice itself, is that of a mathematical technique. By means of such a technique, for example, the technique of calculation invoked in the 1944 remark about the expansion of pi, one can arrive at a result which one recognizes as correct and may be in possession to use this result, the approximation of pi, say, to 5 places for a particular purpose, to estimate, for instance, the area of circular enclosure of a certain radius. This technique has its point and its purpose in the context of what we do with it, and can be learned, taught, communicated, elaborated on in this way as part of the specific language game of, for instance, calculative estimation of areas. But also part of the practices that are called learning, teaching, and communicating mathematics. And I would add to that taught and taught. The homonym that is very pertinent here. It is part of this learning and teaching that one learns that the technique in principle goes on forever, and that there is no end to the decimal expansion of pi, since the rule can always be applied to produce more digits. And in learning this, a student learns also to make sense of the question about whether a string of sevens appears or not anywhere in the total expansion, in a citation mark for a good reason. It's still not done. A bit like talking about a table, but still is just an idea. But all of this is not to say that the expansion is as a whole in the finitely statable rule itself, just waiting, as it were, to be unpacked from it. Rather, it is for Wittgenstein the irreducibility of the calculative technique as technique its role and significance within a human life that gives us whatever it does give us, whatever we can then use or articulate on the level of use for the diverse purposes to which we might put it. This is not to say, of course, that we simply decide or choose freely conventions that decide what the value of the expansion will be, either at any particular place or in general. In pointing to the irreducibility of mathematical technique, Wittgenstein is raising the question what it is for us to follow a procedure or a rule, of how we are thereby guided and in what respect we are free of how our methods and procedures are rooted in the instances and practices of our lives, but also how they nevertheless give us the kind of insight and orientation that consists in knowing how things are. The point is that on the one hand, it makes no sense to say that our practice of calculation is our practice, that it has its point, its purpose, and its whole existence within the broader context of how we do it and what we do with it. But that, on the other, it also makes sense to see its results as completely determinate, objective and fixed in their whole infinite extent. The difficulty of maintaining this position isn't that of accounting for how there can be so much as an objective standard of the correctness of our practices, given that these practices are our own, but rather of showing what such a standard means from within these practices themselves. And this showing, as I have argued, makes essential use of the idea of a technique or a practice which is, on the one hand, integrated in our lives, but on the other, is in principle extendable and responsible to what it is trying to illuminate. How then should we read in this light the 1944 remark about God and the limitations of his omniscience? One of Wittgenstein's goals here is obviously and admittedly to challenge a Platonistic picture of mathematical truths, according to which they are completely determinate and fixed in advance of anything like calculation or perhaps proof, and thereby open in principle, as it were, to simple inspection by a superior entity. In denying that God, even if he knows everything, knows without calculation whether or not there is a string of 3/7 anywhere in the decimal expansion. Wittgenstein is evidently denying that there is any sense to be made, in other words, of a picture of the whole of the decimal expansion as it were, simply given to the deity, along with the knowledge that it is the whole correct expansion, in such a way that he could simply look and see whether the string occurs anywhere, or know this immediately just by being given the rule itself, and without himself calculating. But there is more to Wittgenstein's remark than only the rejection of this Platonist picture. There is also the reminder, equally obvious perhaps, but difficult to hold in balance with the first, anti-Platonist point, that there is a procedure which suffices to calculate successively the digits of the expansion of pi, and thus eventually to find a string of 3/7, if any such string exists. This is just the calculative procedure that one normally uses, or that we can now program computers to follow out much further than we, given the biological limitations of our own finite capacities and limited lifetimes, can do. But the fact that such a procedure can be automated in such a way does not imply that it is not one whose scope and significance is to be understood from within its role in something like a human life. In the very next remark of Reflections for Mathematics, Wittgenstein emphasizes this essential embedding of the calculative procedure as an activity within life and the more general language game of following a rule itself. The concept, as in this quote, the concept of the rule for the formation of an infinite decimal is, of course, not a specifically mathematical one. It is a concept connected with a rigidly determined activity in human life. The concept of this rule is not more mathematical than that of following the rule. Or again, this latter is not less sharply defined than the concept of such a rule itself. For the expression of the rule and the sense is only part of the language game, following the rule. has the same right to speak of such rules in general as of the activities following them. The upshot of these remarks in their context is not indeed to deny that the activity of calculating, for instance, that of calculating the expansion of pi, is a rigidly determined one. The procedure in this case, as in others, is not arbitrary, nor, and this is even more important, is it just a matter of convention or decision, or just made up by us. Moreover, we have, even from within the procedure and the form of activity determined by it, an idea of what it means to talk about what is or is not within the decimal expansion as a whole. We can perfectly well understand, for instance, what it would mean for the sequence in question to be found, as we can also understand that the process might run forever without finding it. It is in this sense and for this reason perfectly legitimate to consider the principle of bivalence as applying to the expansion as a whole. Either the strings of sevens is there or it is not there. Indeed, it's not clear what could be meant by denying this, once we have seen the rule as one that goes on forever in the way it does. What is disputed in the remarks then is not realism in the general or realism about the expansion, but rather the misguided impression that realism itself demands that anyone, God included, could have access to the whole of what is produced by the procedure without going through that procedure himself. It is the procedure or technique that is irreducible. And it is also irreducible that it is something that is gone through, that it is something that can be practiced by someone. It is immaterial to this whether the relevant someone is itself finite or infinite. What matters is rather that these powers actually be applied. This is what Wittgenstein is calling proceeding by means of mathematics in the remark. I think this is incredibly close to Frederick Matthias Alexander in this instance, who clearly points out that the means whereby is the way we do things, even rules and the things that we usually think are abstract or transcendental. This procedure and others like it are not less rigidly determined than we expect mathematical rules to be. That is to say, that they have a role in human life, and essentially so. It is not to say that they do not determine just the results that they do, or that these will not be objective or fully fixed. But equally, it is not determined at all, except as an activity, a procedure that we can understand and go through, something that is done in the context of a human life. The concept of this activity is not, as Wittgenstein says, simply a mathematical one, any more than the broader concept of following rule which it exemplifies. But on the other hand, it is not therefore any less mathematical, for it is in activities of this sort and in the surrounding ones of learning, teaching, communicating and reasoning about them that, in any meaningful sense, doing mathematics consists. Is excellent by Wittgenstein here. He stays clear of the Charybdis or Scylla, and he doesn't fall into the trap of neither Dummett or Putnam, nor in the Kantian solution, which is inevitable, almost inevitable, I would say. It's getting as close as inevitable as possible. He shows that it is a practice doesn't mean that it doesn't have a fixed way that we cannot see or express in words. The Dummetian or Dummett's take is not true, even though it's a conventional, so to speak, a doing by people. We do these things. It doesn't mean that they are haphazardous, arbitrary, random, and that they cannot be shared, which Dummett is implying here. They can indeed be shared. And I say, this makes Wittgenstein the only philosopher who ventures into this. It's not very hard to see that inner speech and inner thinking is extremely helpful in this context. Because the idea, perception that there is an inner picture somewhere that corresponds is in itself its mistake, and once that is established, you go in the Kantian way or you go in the postmodern way. So you need to go to where it starts. And to understand that a proceeding by means of mathematics is the thing that is mathematics. And there is no blasphemy saying God cannot see the answer, because what we would be saying if we say God can see the end of mathematics at the Apocalypse is the same. He can construct a cathedral without doing it. Do you get the drift? I think that's an accurate point. We are saying God can do it, and at the same time we're saying he cannot, by implying that we do not, he doesn't have to do the cathedral. It doesn't even have to be brick by brick. We're saying he will not construct it, and he will, because we subjectively, as fallible creatures, do not understand the process of mathematics. As simply excellent pointing out by Paul Livingston. I think I end there, and I say thank you very much for your patience. I hope you can see also how this relates to the other article about Jacques Derrida and what sort of, so to speak, trap Kant was in, the Enlightenment trap of inner language, inner speech, inner imagery, constructing a real fixed world out there, unchangeable, in a certain way objective, and that this is not what objectivity is about. It is something completely different. I'll put a little pause here. Start seeing here that there is a grand connection here between Wittgenstein and Friedrich Matthias Alexander. And they were active almost at the same time period. By resolving the problem between what is, so to speak, transcendent, accepting that it could be that the final outcome of an endless calculation of pi could lead to 3/7, at the same time showing that it is absolutely dependent on doing it, and that we sometime, somewhere or sometime in this thing do an illegal leap, an unlawful, meaning destroying leap. We don't understand. We are like a child in the before mentioned cathedral that do not, maybe from a far point, doesn't see the cathedral as made of stone, but maybe marshmallow or candy. And the child says, let God construct a cathedral, and it will not be the candy cathedral. So it's hidden here a big fault. Alexander shows that it's the means whereby we do things, and end gaining is a misunderstanding, essentially, not a stressful act of trying to rush things or being impatient. It is a fundamental misunderstanding on how we are participatory in the world. And I conclude here almost, or my prophecy is that Wittgenstein is essential in understanding Alexander. Without that, we will think endgaining is just stress, rushing things, or as the term is so easy to misunderstand, it's almost inevitable. reaching for the end, as he's calling it, is not reaching for any end at all. It's the transcendentalism is a way of not working properly as a person, body and thought, and most definitely thinking that thoughts are inner speech or imagery, and that the explanation of thinking that you do for yourself even is the same as the very thinking. No, it's not. They are disjunct as they could be. They share no similarity. They are having maybe a mutual start in some aspects, but they are not similar. I'd say that is incredibly important. Could be a breakthrough done here in the Palm House today. And I think this is as good a point to end as any point to say thank you very much and have a very pleasant afternoon. Bye bye for now.